This one is certainly one for you, Matt, because it's something that you've been diving into on your videos.
Go ahead.
I know you're writing an ebook on this at the minute. Lipid skewing for PED users, or maybe more specifically, AAS users.
So we're talking about, is it bad, I assume is the question?
Yeah, I guess we could do it all encompassing, like whether just measuring HDL and LDL is enough, what happens if we do see a big reduction on HDL, how high LDL is too high, how do we remedy that, things like that.
Yeah, so I think, firstly, we need to understand that as a PED user, anabolic user, you're going to get a reduction in your HDL, that's going to come down, and your LDL is going to increase. That's pretty normal. We need to understand that that's just cost of doing business, if you want to call it that. The point at which we start to worry is, I guess, based upon your baseline levels, how much we're fluctuating from that, and also how high is our LDL going. So we've done a couple of videos on this in the past, and we've talked about HDL efflux. And efflux is essentially how efficient your HDL fraction is at scavenging LDL particles and getting them out of the bloodstream. Essentially, you reverse cholesterol, transport them out of the liver and get them out of the bloodstream so it can't have any bad effect at your blood vessel. It doesn't tell you, your amount of HDL doesn't tell you how efficient that is, right? So you could have a HDL number at 1 and it could be just as efficient as if your HDL was 0.4. So we don't actually know, like, does that reduction mean anything? Is it a bad thing? Which is why we tend to look at LDL. And if that number goes up, which it likely will do, if that number starts creeping up and creeping up and creeping up, that would tend to indicate there's a bigger risk factor. Because when we get what's called dyslipidemia, where you get an increased amount of LDL versus your HDL, the likelihood of bad stuff happening at that vascular level, i.e. atherosclerosis build-up, where we get plaque build up in the arteries or blood vessels, that becomes more likely to occur, especially with anabolic users. You're getting increased oxidative stress, all these other things which contribute to endothelial dysfunction, which is going to, in turn, increase our risk of atherosclerosis. So to kind of TLDR what I just said, it kind of is normal, but we need to manage those risk factors, making sure HDL isn't dropping too far, making sure we support our HDL function via diet, supplementation, exercise as much as possible, even though those inputs are probably quite small, and then managing how high our LDL goes and also managing those inputs via the same things, diet, supplementation, and just general behaviours, which we can kind of touch on a bit. I guess I'll kind of...
Yeah, well, you know, if someone's going to get their blood work done, and let's say they just genetically have skewed LDL and HDL, even when they're on a TRT dose, or if every time they're blasting these just skew straight away, and they say, well, you know, I can't use super physiological levels at all because this happens. Is it okay to say, well, I'm going to kind of ignore total LDL and HDL and maybe just go with tracking an echo, or?
You could. Echo's obviously only going to show you the physiological change at the heart, so it's probably not going to show what's actually happening at that vascular level. Personally, if I've got a client, I have some who've got quite skew in terms of their HDL drops quite significantly and their LDL rises, I personally go and propose another factor. So I would stick a statin in for LDL management, even if we don't know, like if someone's genetically predisposed to high and low numbers, is that make them more of a risk factor than someone whose numbers stay within range and then shift? Probably not. But again, whenever we see higher LDL, we know that is in and of itself is a risk factor. So I would just say, in that instance, similar how we would use telmisartan just to manage someone's elevations in angiotensin 2, we'd say, look, put this in as a protective prophylactic measure, and that's probably going to be a better option. And then add in additional health checks like your echoes, like your calcium scores, just to make sure nothing's actually happening under the hood.
So why is it that we don't recommend a statin used prophylactically for all androgen users?
The only reason I can think of, I can think of two. I can think of two off the top of my head. One, because it hasn't been mainstream admitted. People haven't said this is something we can use. I think, and part of that is it is often linked to, I guess, metabolic syndrome, metabolic diseases, and obesity. And as bodybuilders, people like to think, that isn't me, I'm not that guy. And then when I've looked into statins, the only downside I can see is a potential, and when I say potential, I'm talking minuscule increase in negative outcomes like strokes. That's the only kind of thing I can see. And when people say, well, I'm healthy, I'm not going to have a stroke, we're talking infinitesimally small. We're talking like 1 in every 10,000 or something.
You always think it's not going to be you, though,
exactly that.
until it is.
So I think when people are saying, well, I don't want a stroke, and if my bloods indicate I don't need this, why would I do that? So I think it's probably those two reasons, but we've discussed this as well. I think there will be a point, maybe the next generation of statins or at least LDL controlled drugs, it's going to be just par for the course. Everyone will be taking this, and as a kind of triple threat stack, people will be taking an ARB, metformin, taking a statin or whatever the next generation is, and potentially a GLP-1 agonist.
Yeah, I've always thought, like, how close are we on the development of statins, where we have something that it, like,
I think we're pretty close.
Yeah, I would say so. I think Peter Bond's done some good stuff on this, where, you know, we're getting closer. Even the red rice yeast seems to be like pretty damn good.
Well, that's something I actually put into every client who's got any form of like elevated LDL. I take it.
Well, mechanistically, it's I don't, because my LDL's always been perfect.
Yeah.
But I think if I did, even prophylactically,
I think it's a very
even though my echoes are always great, I think I'd go. You know, the probability.
I'm also thinking with echoes and calcium scores is we're looking at an area.
You're looking at architecture.
Yeah,
of
and
the heart,
we're also looking at, with a calcium score, it's done at a specific area. It might just be aortically, it may just be at the heart, we're not looking at every single blood vessel, right? So we need to be thinking, it's always like, okay, what does that show us? Oh, that's good, but what next?
What about particle size testing then? Is that something that you do with clients?
I do. So this is always where the rubber meets the road, is...
Why don't you tell them what particle size testing is?
So what you've got within HDL, LDL fractions is you've got different sizes. So there's different fractions of HDL, HDL2, HDL3, and they've got different sizes. They correspond to how easily that can move around the blood vessel, essentially. If you think about a capillary, if it's a large blood vessel, if it's a large HDL fraction, it can get caught. It's got different ability to have an efflux, etc. Same with LDL, you've got different sizes, and they can often offer more or less insight into, is this a bigger cardiovascular risk? So we know, for example, when we look at LDL, if we look at, instead of looking at like LDL fractions, we can look at apolipoproteins, which is more of an indicator of this LDL fraction in itself could be a higher risk, right? So we're not necessarily looking at LDL, we're looking at the size of the particle, we're looking at how many of these particles occur in a period, in a certain space, in a vessel, which can all contribute to risk. So if we start to look at, okay, are we looking at a HDL2 or 3 fraction, which can indicate the size, which one's more prevalent within our blood? So, and this is kind of leading back to the point I was mentioning with apolipoproteins, is that may be a better indicator than just LDL of our cardiovascular risk.
So you'd recommend like ApoB, ApoA as like just standardised blood testing for...
Again, where the rubber meets the road is it's
they
more
have
expensive.
skewed lipids.
Yeah, if they've got skewed lipids, potentially start to look a little bit deeper. And something where Joe showed me, and we've actually discussed before, is Randox is a different company we talked about, where they offer a slightly more in-depth than just saying, this is your HDL, this is your LDL. You start looking at ApoA, ApoB, ApoA being your HDL fraction, but also a thing called a lipoprotein. So your lipoprotein A is another fraction, which we get in LDL, which is also a causative risk factor for atherosclerosis build-up. So it might be something we want to look at there as well. So instead of just looking at, okay, my LDL is good and my HDL is good, which we've all kind of been victim of and we've all been guilty of, we look a little bit deeper and say, like, am I looking at specific fractions? Now, unfortunately, I don't think we've got the easy access to say, like, am I looking at, let's say, HDL2, HDL3 fractions, or my specific particle size of LDL very easily. But we can certainly look at things like the ApoBs, ApoAs, which are more indicative of risk, which we can fairly, I say, comfortably look at.
And what do we actually know about direct mechanisms of cardiovascular, let's just say hypertrophy driven purely by androgens, outside of increases in body weight?
So this is a really, really difficult one. So we've got, I've been speaking to the John Moores University, their cardiology department up in Liverpool. They're doing some great work in terms of anabolic research with PD users. And what we've seen is that, and this is kind of echoed within a lot of case studies and data.
Echoed?
Pun not intended. So as we get an increased anabolic use, we're going to get subsequent heart growth. And that let's just assume in this instance, we're looking at just heart size in general. We're not looking at cardiac myopathy. As your heart size grows, we're saying that, like the initial train of thought was this is happening because we're taking anabolics. But if we scale that to body weight, so as you would imagine a bigger human being, for example, think about Thor, right? He's a very, very big man, about 6'8", 400 pounds. He's naturally going to have a bigger heart than me, right? Is that down to his anabolic use, or is it down to the fact that he's just a massive human? And when we scale it to body weight, it seems like it's just due to the size of the man, right? So if he was to lose that weight, potentially he wouldn't run into problems. So that's kind of one train of thought. Now, it's difficult to differentiate between, am I getting a bigger heart just because I'm a bigger person, or is this running into cardiac myopathy? So cardiac myopathy is essentially where we're getting an issues, like a disease of the heart, let's say, but it's where the heart's growing but disproportionately to others. So you can get concentric hypertrophy, where essentially the wall's getting a lot thicker. We've kind of all seen this, where people think of LVH, left ventricular hypertrophy, with that left ventricle which pumps blood to the body. When the walls of that atrium, or walls of that chamber are getting thicker, that's concentric. And it can be dilated as well, where it gets thinner but the heart gets bigger. And that's where we can run into problems. It's difficult to sit here and say where the line crosses, but from what we know from animal research, from limited human research we've got, this is kind of the main reason we promote the use of something like telmisartan, angiotensin receptor blocker, because most of the negatives that we're getting in terms of the cardiac remodeling, like I say, where the heart's getting disproportionately larger or smaller in certain areas, that seems to be increased elevations in angiotensin 2 or our renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, which causes the problems. If we block that, for the most part, we seem to block most of the negatives that come with that. Now, that isn't a blanket statement saying, take an ARB, take as many drugs as you want, you'll be fine, but we're still at that crossover point of going, okay, are the negatives purely because of this one cascade, or is it because we're taking this amount of drugs, or is it because we're getting a bigger human? Where's the problem? And I think more research is needed, but it's still not completely clear. Is it just the anabolic use that's causing this, or is it the size? It could be anabolic use plus drugs plus all the risk factors that we're seeing for that individual. So it's difficult to say, but I think we know anabolics makes your heart bigger. Is it just because you're bigger as a person?
And it probably doesn't matter. You still need to track and
it's also
stay on top of it.
It's also what we're doing with that information, right? Like there's no free passes in this shit. I think we still, yes, okay, your heart may be fine, it may not be, but how do you know? We still got to check. And I think for anyone watching this, please go and or drop me a message, certainly, and I can put you in contact with these guys to be part of this body of research, because I think this is this sort of stuff where, as an anabolic user, we could be contributing to saving your lives, our lives, and multitude of people down the line. And that's kind of obviously something we're big on, is educating you guys on the risk of what we're doing and trying to minimise that.
Yeah, since you're talking about prophylactic use of drugs like telmisartan and other angiotensin receptor blockers or metformin and etc., and we're talking about risks involved here, I want to roll this on to the topic of harm reduction in general. So something that we probably need to clear up in terms of our positioning, our standing in the industry of educators, and where we sit on this kind of landscape of the information that we're providing and what the outcome's going to be. So harm reduction is a term that we have used and we've thrown around primarily to describe Matt's position in the company and where his educational material leads. But I think that there is a mental block and misunderstanding about the definition of harm reduction. And of course, this isn't like a medically defined thing. We're talking about recreational use of PEDs, so there isn't a fixed definition or description. So it's nobody's fault for misinterpreting our position, but I want to make our position here very clear. So at Physique Collective, the aim of our material is first and foremost to be results driven. I am a bodybuilding coach or physique athlete coach that only coaches competitors, and I need, my aim, my mission, my job is to get them to place as highly as possible in their shows and to win shows. And with that comes with it a degree of PED exposure that would fall outside the realms of most people's definition of harm reduction. So the point isn't to reduce harm from PEDs to the point that you completely attenuate and even eliminate the the results. I've got clients that are super heavyweight bodybuilders. You can't escape the fact that these guys are going to be using north of 2,000 milligrams of anabolics. They're going to be using north of 6 to 8 units of growth hormone. They're going to be using north of 20 to 30 units of insulin. This isn't where we fall. We fall within the mantra of the primary key tenet that has to remain is that the individual receiving the information has to still be able to get to the desired end result. Our position in the industry is to educate the individual on how to get there whilst accruing the least harm along the way possible. I could give a real easy, practical, metaphorically true example. Let's say you, as a genetically unique individual, needs 3,000 milligrams of anabolics to get from here to here. That could be 2,000 milligrams of testosterone plus 1,000 milligrams of trenbolone plus a milligram of arimidex a day, and you would certainly accrue more deleterious health costs as compared to maybe running testosterone as high as you could tolerate without the use of the arimidex, filling the remainder with the most benign DHT derivative option, using prophylactic measures of drug inputs like telmisartan and metformin along the way. So the fundamental thing that we need our audience to understand is this is not about reducing harm and being on a sports TRT for the rest of your life and edging into anti-aging kind of arena. That's not our position here, or it's at least not mine. The key fundamental tenet of our position here is still getting you where you want to be, wherever that is for you. It might be competitive super heavyweight. It might be first timer in men's physique, where of course the outcome would be far less costly and of less total magnitude. How do you get there, if you can get there genetically, whilst accruing the least harm possible?
I think that's a brilliant way of putting it. And the way I kind of come at this is, to use an example, right, is we look at drug use in terms of recreational drug use in the 80s, 90s. The original concept was don't do drugs, and that didn't fucking work, right? People were still going to do it, right? So what they did instead is they educated. And our entire premise is we're going to educate you on the risks and then allow you to get to your destination. So think of it like driving a car. If you want to get from A to B, as Joe said, and that B might be winning at the Olympia. Let's just set the goal as high as you want. If you're going to drive a car from A to B, you first want to know how to drive the car. Okay, fine. You can then pick faster cars to get there. That's absolutely fine. And you may end up in a sports car. But in terms of, in that journey of getting A to B, would you still wear a seatbelt? That's kind of where we come in, is you know the risk, you can drive the car, but is it going to hurt you to put the seatbelt on, which may make that journey a little bit safer? Is it going to take away the risk? Absolutely, absolutely not. You're still going to go very quickly to get to your destination, but stick the seatbelt on, do it a little bit safer than otherwise intended. And that's the entire thought process, is making sure you've got the information and understanding of the risk in order to take and make those decisions to get you to where you want to be.
Right, the next topic that was requested to cover is Deloads, specifically the new Deloads study. So there's a few
Talk for the new Deloads study, Joe.
Well, I'll do the bits that are applicable to the audience, because there were some metrics in there that don't really apply to our outcomes of hypertrophy, like strength specifically and things like that. So let's talk about lean body mass gain, duration of exposure to each trainer block and things like that. So we've essentially got two groups here. One group is training for 9 weeks straight. The other group is training for 4 weeks, taking 1 week off, and then training for another 4 weeks. So collectively, both groups have 9 weeks in the study. One group is training for 9 weeks straight. The other group is training for 8 weeks total with a 1 week break in the middle. And they're training the lower body. Upper body sessions weren't tracked, but they were doing them at home, I believe. Whether they were adherent to that, I don't know. But in the lab, training lower body, I believe it was up to 20 sets per week on quads to volitional failure. So they're absolutely hammering it. Yeah. You know, that's not easy. So potential of them overreaching systemically, you'd think would be pretty damn high. And these were trained subjects, you know. So this is a really cool study, and, you know, really a one-of-a-kind study. And also this was pre-print released before it went through peer review. So, you know, I love where science is going now, where authors will put studies out on like social media, and you've got access to them and you can critique them and give reviews of them before they would even be peer reviewed, which is epic. So the cognitive bias of the bodybuilding world would look at this data set and likely say, well, the group trained for 9 weeks and they progressed throughout And even their motivation to train was higher than the deload group, post-deload, which I would somewhat expect. So we just don't need to deload. I don't think that's applicable. The most interesting takeaway for me from the study, and the reason why I don't think that's applicable is anybody that's trained with any degree of seriousness for a long period of time knows that that is ineffective. Whether it's 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, 16 weeks, whatever, eventually you're going to need to deload or your body will deload for you. It's just going to happen. But anyway, one really interesting thing for me was that both groups gained the same amount of muscle. So basically, we're saying you could do 1 week less work
and gain the same amount
of muscle. I think this speaks, and this is just an interpretive point, maybe a hypothetical, not necessarily a proven mechanism. I think that speaks for the resensitization effect that occurs from a deload. Also need to say that I think some of the metrics would have been skewed by the fact that they didn't deload, they had a full rest. So they didn't taper volume, they didn't taper intensity or relative effort, they didn't taper load, they just had a full week off of the gym, and that's not a deload structure what I would recommend. Recovery is going to be less. In that circumstance, you will lose some of the neurological adaptations of skill acquisition of performing the movements and things like that, which is potentially why strength adaptations drop. That would be my concern with that one. I wouldn't recommend that. But I think the greatest takeaway is the fact that there was quite clearly a resensitization effect. And I really don't think it means that you just don't need to deload. It could potentially mean that if you run a single body part specialization with static volume, I don't know if there was progressive overload built in there. I mean, if they were training to failure, stimulus would have been pretty high anyway. If they would eventually hit the point of overreaching, maybe. I don't know if their load and rep performance attenuated as the mesocycle went on. But at least it tells us that you're certainly not losing progress if you deload. And when you need to deload, you will know that you need to deload. Which brings me on to the next topic, is something I get asked quite frequently. Is like, do you like proactive or reactive deloads? I think both are problematic and you should probably sit in the middle somewhere. I would always recommend proactively planning a deload period, but let me put some sort of maxims on this. So let's say we say, right, we're going to train for 4 weeks. And there's going to be a progression scheme built in there of load and reps. And then if your stimulus proxies indicate a necessity to do so, we may move training volume up on all body parts or a specificity of 1 or 2. Let's say you get through that 4 weeks and you're thinking, I feel great. Got no symptomologies of needing a deload. Sleep hasn't skewed. Still progressing in the gym. Motivation to train is high. Do another week. Do another week, just keep going. To quote Steve Hall, and I don't know if he was the originator of this quote, you should earn your deload. You should definitely earn your deload. However, if you do get to the end of those 4 weeks and you've got some of those symptoms creeping in, but you're an emotional type that can't bring themselves to reactively deload, this is where I think that's problematic, then just take the deload. And this study gives further ground into the fact that you're probably driving further progression because you'll get some resensitization and you'll be able to drive more progression the other side of the deload. Worst case scenario, you're not losing any skeletal muscle hypertrophy progress and you'll still feel better the other side of it because of the symptomologies that you've got.
I always think studies like this are quite dangerous to sit there and almost change your viewpoint on, oh, deloads are crap, deloads are great. To me, it really, if you go back a couple of years to the refeed studies, where people all of a sudden said,
great example,
refeeds are useless. All of a sudden people say, you don't need to refeed. And you're like, well, not necessarily, right? We know there may be potential benefits with psychology there, okay? And the same thought process applies to deloads. Firstly, we need to look at a couple of things. Don't always just take either end of this camp saying, I'm never going to deload, or I'm going to deload at specific timeframes. As Joe said, you kind of want to be somewhere in the middle and use a series of metrics to help your decision-making process, right? If you never need a deload, or you never take one, the chances are, A, you're probably not training very hard, and B, you're probably going to get injured quite a lot. On the other side is if you're taking deloads every 3 weeks because you're trying to be quote-unquote optimal, again, the chances are you're probably not going to be building much muscle because you're not going to be training very hard and you're probably shying away from the hard work that needs to be done on the back end of a meso. The reality is, like Joe rightly said, is find out where that point is for you. But also, the bit that we kind of lose track on is what are the top performers doing, right? When we look at, and this isn't a great example, we look at all bodybuilders, everyone's going to do things their own different way. But look at top performing bodybuilders, look at any top performing athlete. Are they having periods of rest in between pushing their loading in whatever medium we look at? Yes, they are, right? And there's a reason for that. It might not just be physiologically they need a break. It might be mentally they can't push at that extreme high level for a period of time. They may need to back off, which may coincide with some physiological benefits in terms of you're getting readaptations to a novel stimulus, which we might see. But it might just be they need a slight switch off for a period of time to then ramp up that intensity and go again. Because it's like with excessive set volumes. If you're doing 10 sets of an exercise, you're probably not going to be giving as much to that as you would be in that first set. So think about week 10 of your training block. Are you approaching that with the same intensity that you were at week 3? Probably not. You might need a mental reset. So it's getting this full body of data and not letting one study make your decision for you. It's just going, what is actually probably the best thing for my athlete to get the most results? And that might be physiological, it might be psychological, it could be a myriad of factors.
Well, let me see what this next topic was. I forgot.
I find stuff like that. So people are like, Deloads, fuck him. You're like, okay.
Right. This next topic to cover, do tattoos, excuse me, do tattoos, or more specifically, your blackout stuff, so this stuff, affect point scoring in competitions? Now, my beautiful wife has done a video on this already that is on Physique Collective because she is a judge. She also knows everything there is to know about tan, skin prep, all of that stuff. She is the person in the country, maybe in the world, that knows this better than anybody else. And there's also loads of articles on this kind of stuff on compact.store if you guys want to check it out. But here's what I've learned through this. Yes, they can. Now, by criteria, you're not really supposed to look at tattoos, but in technicality, they are an imbalance. And if they're blurring your conditioning or your separation, for example, if somebody's got a full leg piece, it's very hard to see detail in the VLs. If they've got a full back piece that's thick with color, it's very hard to see separation through the upper and mid back. So yeah, it most definitely could negatively impact your results. But
I mean, we've seen this as well. I mean, do you remember
I've seen a lot of people with this.
Erin
Thompson.
Erin Thompson.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's got a leg piece, and I remember I'm gonna butcher this, but I think she was marked down for it. And then the next competition they make
yeah.
up.
So Erin's a good example to lead me on to what I was going to mention next. Firstly, what are you going to do about it? You've got a tattoo. You could get laser. Sure, it's a bit of a ball ache. The scarring that laser leaves might be worse. I don't know. I've got no experience with it. What I will say is tan technology has come a hell of a long way in the last 10 years. There are tattoo covers. So the old tattoo covers used to be quite cakey, like foundation-like. These days, the tattoo covers are unbelievable. Like one of my clients, Matt Adams, he's got a full body piece, like literally head to toe covered in tattoos. His tattoo cover last year, you couldn't see a thing. And he was peeled in condition, he looked grainy, he was dry, it didn't skew the look at all. Panatta do a really good one. I'm pretty sure that's what Erin used on her quad. But I wouldn't worry about it because the technology now is so good. And what I've noticed more this year is that a lot of the tanners at these IFBB events have had tattoo cover with them. At the European ones they have, and I've seen some guys get the tattoo cover on. It's fantastic. You know, like look at Rob Taylor sleeve. Yeah. You know, you can't see anything. So I wouldn't worry about it. If you don't get on it, yeah. If it's in a place that's going to skew striation, yeah, it will negatively impact your placing. But the technology now is so good that it wouldn't be a worry.
What we got? I thought they were going to ask something weird about like toxicity or something, and I was like, there we go.
You got some good ones so far.
You've been alright to be fair.
Some more topic. I wrote some of them down. Yeah. Those ones that we got now, but shit.
I'm tactfully not listening to you now because I know I've got to listen to it all again.
Yeah, that's very sensible.
Yeah, true.
Don't listen to our shit twice.
So it'll be more interesting to listen to. What am I doing now?
Okay, there was one. Androgens in the prostate.
I don't know a lot about that.
Okay, well, you know, there's some difficulty about talking about androgens' relationship to the prostate because it's not something that's been like incredibly well studied. I wish I knew we were going to talk about this because I would have dug out the study. But
Let's do it next time. I think it's probably better off. I know a little bit.
I'm going to go into. Well, there was a landmark study basically that showed the DHT saturation occurs at TRT type doses.
Yeah,
but there's huge limitations on that study, so that's why we've got to be careful about it.
I don't know a lot about it, so I wouldn't feel comfortable conversing it.
Oh, here's one that somebody asked.
I quite like opinion ones. You know, what was that one?
Someone asked me about the sauna because I keep getting the sauna.
I've got an interesting, not counter argument, but a thought process to it.
Right.
But like, it won't disregard what you're saying. It actually confirms it in a different way.
Right. Someone has asked me about the sauna. Because I've got a sauna.
Joe just wanted to show off his sauna in his house. Yeah. That's all this is about.
Yeah, someone asked me about sauna. I'm so rich, so I've got a sauna.
I asked myself this question.
Look at this, Matt. You can see it.
Yeah, I asked myself this question to show you my sauna.
So in my giant bathroom that's gold coated, I have a sauna in there, which I use, and I'll tell you why I use it. So I got interested in the research on heat exposure after visiting John and Emma Thackeray once at their beautiful palace called the Hen House, which I will be at again on September the 16th, which I'm very much looking forward to because it is the most beautiful place I've ever been to on earth. Actually, I would say that.
I need to go.
Anyway, they had a sauna there, and admittedly, the quality of the Physique Collective clothing, mate, I'm pulling bits off it. Admittedly, I had ignorantly looked at things like sauna as one of these holistic, homeopathic things that wouldn't have any good data behind them.
It's almost like a biohacking type thing.
I'm very aware of my own intellectual arrogance, and I try to catch myself on it as soon as I do that. So I actually went away from that weekend and I got to researching heat exposure therapy, and since then some very interesting data has come out, and also since then some systematic reviews on heat therapy, heat exposure, whatever you want to call, have come out. Some really interesting stuff, even on just spending time in the sun. There was a study I saw recently about spending time in a car, in a hot car. Sauna blanket, electric saunas, infrared saunas, Finnish sauna. There's a study going on right now on literally exposing your testicles to the sun and its effects on fertility. It's got nothing to do with what we're talking about in here. But essentially, I got very interested in the antioxidant effects of heat exposure, the degree of heat necessary for the duration of time necessary to drive a robust outcome and sort of generating a minimum effective dose across all of those metrics that we mentioned there, you know, the sauna blanket, the sun, the infrared sauna, blah, blah, blah. I actually posted a study, very large scale study over, was it a 28-year period on Physique Collective the other day. Now, specifically I'm interested on this for PED users, something we were talking about earlier, cardiovascular health, cardiovascular disease management, all-cause mortality is another thing that was tracked on that. So, and what this study found was that individuals that are saunaing 3 to 4 times a week, 15 to 20 minutes as the kind of minimum, there was a seriously robust decrease in incidence of cardiovascular disease and events, and a seriously robust decrease in all-cause mortality. I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head. I want to say 40% reduction.
I can't remember if it was significant.
So don't G-check me on this one, Instagram scientists. It's on the Physique Collective forum. So with that in mind, I do use my sauna 4 days a week at 20 minutes at 70 degrees. That's as hot as it goes. The main thing you find in these studies is that you do have to get very hot and sweat profusely for a long period of time, basically. On the other side of the coin, cold exposure, I haven't really found anything of great utility in there other than like neurological things like dopamine increase, but You know, I'm not, I mean, I am a dopamine seeker, but I'm definitely not hopping in some freezing cold water for it. Whereas there are physiological health benefits to heat exposure therapy. I will say there's a dose response, although it seems to, it's like an inverted J curve. Kind of like it gets really good really quick and then tapers off. So, and also the duration of exposure. Basically, if you've got a finished sauna, 15 minutes, 4 days a week, excellent. If you've got an infrared, you probably have to hike that up to 20 minutes. If you've got an electric, maybe a bit more, not well studied. Sauna blanket even more. If you do have a sauna blanket, I would like get fully clothed and get in it to get as hot as you can. But general recommendation is like to get really hot and sweat as often as possible. And I mean, how often are you like dripping with sweat for a good period of time?
Not often.
Never, you know. So, and as an androgen user, we should be very interested in cardiovascular concerns. But there are other very interesting inputs that just haven't been as well studied, but the data is very promising. Neural health, fertility seems to be a good one because there was something about balls shouldn't be exposed to that heat, but the data seems to be going the other way. Insulin sensitivity seems to increase quite robustly. There's a little bit of research on brown adipose tissue activation in heat in sauna. I don't think I've got anything conclusive on that.
The one thing that, when I put my critical thinking hat on, it's the one, it's not even a criticism, it's just, I'd like to understand this, and Joe, maybe you might know something about this. I always think, what sort of person is able to get that time to have that effect? So let's just say you've got someone who's having 4 saunas a week, right? They probably got,
Like me.
Like you, right? So we've got Joe in our, imagine a 70-year-old Joe. Right,
We've got, let's hope I get
you'll get there with the saunas. So you've got a 70-year-old Joe, right? He's probably got a fairly health-conscious life if he's able to get 4 saunas, right? He's probably fairly low stress. He's probably quite time-rich, fairly financially rich if he's able to do all these things.
I've got a sauna.
Exactly, he's got a gold-plated sauna. So if you've got that individual, how much benefit is that from their general lifestyle versus the addition of the heat therapy? And that's whilst I love a sauna, that would be my interest in knowing what's the additional benefit. And obviously I'm creating an avatar there, I'm making up someone, but I'm assuming that person is that kind of person who's doing those things. Where does the difference lie? Yeah,
the utility of time is an extremely important concept, and the value of the present moment is something that we don't spend it. And I won't get too philosophical on you here, but you know, the moments in time that you are spent in the sauna, what is the utility above and beyond what you could be doing?
It's more so is what's the addition of the heat as opposed to, you've got someone who's living that lifestyle.
Well, as opposed to them doing aerobic work or something like that.
No, I'm probably phrasing my question badly. So you've got that person who's doing all those things, that's probably giving them a net health benefit in all-cause mortality reduction.
So you're saying the population study. Well, this is what was interesting in that Finnish study, because there, everyone does it.
That's what, yeah.
Obese people, fit people. So it's cultural. It's not a health.
So it's in addition. And they're noting that against people that of the same culture.
Yes.
Yeah, that's my question.
So that's the point.
So we can say it's pretty much because of this heat.
Yeah, but since we were talking about the concept of the utility of time, a lot of people say I don't have time for the sauna, which may be true. I'm not one of these people that says everybody has time for everything, because some people don't. You know, Will Bassett, if you're watching this,
you do a Molly May. You do a Molly May on everyone else. So
silly that is. But so, for example, I do a lot of audio books and I listen to a hell of a lot of debates. I probably do about 2 hours a day of philosophy and politics debates a day. But I'll build these into other things, and this is my learning time. So when I'm walking the dog, I'm not listening to music, I'm listening to an audio book or a debate on YouTube Premium, shout out, changed my life. And the sauna's the same thing. Or I'll use Sam Harris's meditation app in there, and I'll do my deep diaphragmic breathing practice whilst I'm in there, which gives it a level up to the difficulty as well. So, you know, the utility in that time, saying, right, these 20 minutes, I'm going to do my deep breathing practice, which is another thing that sounds a bit homeopathic, but does have very robust health benefits as studied. I'm going to learn some stuff on this audio book, and I'm going to get my heat exposure done there. And the thing is, if your gym doesn't have a sauna, you know, there's some pure gyms, or no, it's not pure gym, fitness first or fitness for less. There may be one around the corner with a sauna. Walk there to get your steps in, sit in it for 20 minutes, walk home. You know, if you've got the time, it is of benefit. It's not as important as things like getting your minimum target of steps in or getting your resistance training in. But there certainly is a robust effect.
And if you can do it, why not?
Yeah. Right, we've got a topic request here. Along the lines of, what are our thoughts on high testosterone, high test cycles? Why do the big guys seem to prefer high test? What is it about high test? So I'm guessing that just means like, what is unique about that is attracting people towards it? And I think my first word on this would be, firstly, assessing an almost functional misunderstanding of some messaging that we've been putting across and other PED educators have been putting across, which probably hasn't been explained very well.
There almost seems to be this mindset where we think that test is bad, where that isn't the case.
That is a point, but that's not what I was going to say, but that's a great point. What I was going to say is the thing that...
What were you going to say, Joe?
The thing that goes around the PED education space now, which is a truth, but lacks context in some degree, and I'll explain the context, is all anabolic androgenic steroids build muscle at exactly the same rate. That is a truth. Maybe the more objectively true statement would be around about the same dose when doses are escalated into our working dose ranges. But the context that we need to apply here is we're only talking about the androgen receptor there. So what a molecule does when it binds to the androgen receptor and transcribes anabolism, like turning on muscle protein synthesis, therefore leading to protein accretion. There are other things that these molecules do that we need to pay attention to, and this is where, when we look at testosterone as a molecule, not only do you get the androgen receptor activation and action, you've also got the fact that testosterone, or a portion of testosterone, is going to bind to the aromatase enzyme and end up as estradiol. It's going to convert to estrogen, and estrogen in and of itself is very anabolic. It's lipolytic in ways. It drives more fatty acid oxidation. It has relative synergies with the GH-IGF axes. It has also tons of health benefits. It's neuroprotective, cardioprotective, it's neurogenerative. So this is where testosterone does gain an edge, realistically, on other molecules. It's going to build just as much muscle at the androgen receptor as these other molecules, but you get estrogen as well. So really my opinion on high testosterone cycles is, yeah, I've always said run as much testosterone as you can tolerate, because you're going to lose that additional benefit if you can't tolerate it and you start dropping down your estradiol, your blood serum estrogen, more specifically estradiol, with an aromatase inhibitor. But if you can use more testosterone within the total milligrams of your stack design, do it. And when you're talking about why do the big guys like to use testosterone, well, you know, you've got to think a lot of these big guys are working in the 3, 4, 5 gram dose range. A gram of testosterone to 2 grams of non-estrogenic molecules as a androgen-estrogen ratio, that's not crazy. You know, it's like one guy doing 300 test 600 masteron, for example. You know, and you've got to also remember that the aromatase, the consequential aromatase outcome is going to be less and less with graded dosages of testosterone coming up. It doesn't trend linearly. So the more total milligrams that you're using, the more total milligrams in ratio you could have with testosterone.
I think there's a couple of factors. I always like to look at the real world practicalities of these things. And as Joe said, look, there's going to be a level of dosage that is required for a larger, or at least a competitive bodybuilder. So let's say you need to go to 3 grams total. We've got a limited pool of drugs from which to go, take from. So if we just, to say real simply, we've got Test, Mast and or Primo, and let's say Nandrolone, perhaps. Where are we going to get our numbers from? Well, Test is going to have to go up at some point to the highest level tolerable. And that number is not fixed in stone either. I'm someone who tends to get fairly sensitive nipples at a relatively low dose testosterone. But as I go up to that 2.5 gram dose I've been before, I was up nearly at a gram before of Test without any issues, because my non-aromatizing compounds were there. I still ran, for someone that is what I would consider to be a pretty standard sort of sensitive to estrogen guy, I can still run it up very high when my total dosage allows me to do so. So I think when we've got these drugs available, you think, why would we not run it higher for those reasons Joe listed? And also from a very practical real world example, you've only got so many drugs you can run up, push that one as high as you can.
And it's most definitely the most beneficial when it comes to the risk reduction input of estrogen as well, and believe me, you'll feel terrible if you just titrate DHT derivatives and don't touch.
Well, I've been there. I've pushed. I was of the crowd where I'm not going to test anything higher than like 3 milligram per kilogram, and I was weighing nearly 120 kg, I think at the time. I was taking over 2.2 gram of Primo, and on 300 milligram of test a week, and I felt like shit. And as soon as you readjust those ratios, you're like, well, actually, all of a sudden my sex drive's back. I feel better, my joints feel better, all the estrogenic protective side of the things that we want are back in the mix. My total drug load hasn't changed, my stack design has. What previously I couldn't have gone above 300 milligram of test, or run into issues, all of a sudden we can push that higher and actually feel way better.
Yes, you spoke about nandrolone as a drug option there. So let's talk a little bit about nandrolone, because that's a question that comes up on the forum quite a bit. Typically, like
for me, I'm sorry to cut across you there, Joe. I think one of the reasons
mate, that was very rude.
I know, very rude guy. One of the reasons I see, and it almost comes across, and please forgive me if you're watching this and this isn't the reason, but I always feel people are looking for a reason to use it. I want to use this, and if that's the case, by all means, go ahead. If you're looking for a reason, look, you can just experiment. That's absolutely fine. What we're talking about here is the potential impact it may have deleteriously, to use one of Joe's words. Or when you may...
I invented that word, you know.
Joe invented that.
Oxford Dictionary.
Or where we may want to think about using it in specific circumstances. So, sorry to cut across, if you want to use it, you're more than welcome to. And that's one of the reasons I almost feel people want us to say, okay, it's fine. If you want to use it, please do.
Yeah, well, you make a great point, because you're essentially talking about unique utility of the molecule. You know, when we pick any drug, we're looking at what is the goal and what is the most benign way to bring me there, but still provide the outcome that actually gets me there, like what we were talking about with the risk reduction thing. And on the forum, it's been asked a few times, like, Joe, why don't I see nandrolone in your client stack designs? I can actually think of one client off the top of my head. I probably shouldn't name him because he's a big financial dude. He's also big physically. If you're watching this, you know who you are, because you use nandrolone, who uses it. But as Matt said, rightfully so, if you use it and you like it and you get on well with it, you know, I'm not going to recommend that you don't use it. That's a great idea. But let's talk about that unique utility. So for muscle growth, as we've just said about testosterone, at the androgen receptor, about the same outcome. So it's not giving us anything unique there. It's not giving us the estrogenic benefit that testosterone is. The actual estrogenic outcome of nandrolone is something that's still really contested in human data. It's not very clear what aromatization action is relevant and what direct estrogen receptor action is relevant. There's a little bit of a mystery, and there seems to be a great variability of estrogenic effect with nandrolone between individuals. So I couldn't say with certainty what the outcomes are going to be there. We've also got the concern of the lack of DHT outcome. Now that's also, I wouldn't necessarily say that's a concern. It's not a concern if you use an exogenous testosterone, but there is a trend that's not as popular now, but certainly did used to be, with using nandrolone as a HRT or using nandrolone alone. You will have no 5-alpha reductase action there, and you need DHT for proper physiological function. Just
a little aside, people that are diagnosed with what is called a micropenis, they have no 5-alpha reductase, so they cannot get DHT as going through puberty as an infant. So that's why they develop a micropenis. So for people that, I'm not saying we're going to run into having a micropenis as an adult, but we want DHT for proper sexual function, right? Proper actually getting an erection.
Yeah, to add on
part of the factor.
On some studies that look at basically erectile strength,
yep.
Erectile power, would you call it?
Rigidity.
Magnitude of girth. Basically, the superior outcome is high estrogen plus high DHT. Like, high estrogen in absence of DHT does provide an increased effect above nothing. High DHT, low estrogen as compared to nothing, robust effect. The best effect is high estrogen and DHT, so you're going to want both. Anyway, but as long as you're using a sufficient dose of testosterone to convert to DHT there, you are going to be fine. I have concerns with nandrolone. The fact that it's a steroidal progestin, and although the studies aren't incredibly robust right now, the leaning of it being more neurotoxic than other molecules is highly concerning to me. And I worry a lot about neurotoxicity because of the lack of clear, concise data that we have on it right now, but the data that we have on it shows that it's really not looking good. And it's only seemed to be looking worse as more data comes out. So if we can avoid that, we should. So, you know, the question comes back around, okay, so what, and DHT derivatives don't appear to be as neurotoxic as synthetic steroidal progestins. So if you have like primobolan here and nandrolone here, we're like, okay, well, both are going to grow the same muscle at the androgen receptor, but one of them is more neurotoxic than the other, and my goal is to gain muscle and or lose body fat. Well, we're obviously going with primo, so what's the unique utility? Well, it seems to be in this potential for tendon, ligament, joint support. And the studies on this are not great. There's a survey-based study where they add nandrolone onto TRT that I've posted on Physique Collective about, but then that leaves all kinds of questions, you know. Was it just more total milligrams of anabolics? Was it potentially the estrogenic actions of nandrolone? Was it its actions as a progestin? That seems probable. Was it its actions at the glucocorticoid receptor? I don't know, but at least the study did show, well, when they added nandrolone, there was joint relief. But then my mind goes towards, well, what options have we got that aren't anabolic androgenic steroids that can provide joint relief? Have you got your training execution nailed to not cause joint stress or tendon and ligament integrity degradations and stuff? There's over-the-counter supplementations that we can dive into there. There's hyaluronic acid inputs. There's, what's it called? The ozone therapy stuff that has great clinical outcomes. So do we need to use nandrolone?
I think it goes back to that first point. I think oftentimes people want a reason. Now, just to go on top of that, this is actually something where, and I'd always encourage people, if you want to do it, as I said before, experiment, have a go. I've got numerous injuries, knees, I'm old, right? I've got joint structures that hurt. I tried this, and it's just like when Joe was coaching me, we tried this. And I stopped because it made me feel like shit. And ultimately, your real world anecdote for you as an individual is going to tell you most of what you need to know. And whilst Joe's kind of mentioned about the neurotoxicity, again, not being overly clear, if you've taken nandrolone, you'll know if it has an impact on you psychologically or not. That's going to be as much data as you need to say, you know what, it isn't working for me. And when I compare that to what I've got available, like I say, when Primo's on the table, maybe I'll go for that because it doesn't make me feel like shit, right? And that's ultimately the discussion that you need to have is, does this drug work for me or not? This is the data, this is the real world application, let's marry the two and make your choice.
Yes. Okay, the next topic we've been asked to cover, it's a direct question. It's, can you compete healthily? And this is a good one for us to go into.
It's a great question.
We were literally just sat in the garden with my wife because she's just recently competed in WBFF for the first time and won in New York and got a pro card first try. Who's the coach? Who can nail every fed? I'm joking, guys, by the way. My wife would say that though.
I guess it's how are we defining healthy?
Well, let's firstly structure the argument or the discussion, right? Let's not discuss healthier, because we could be on that forever. Yes, there's a healthier way to compete as compared to other ways. So let's say healthily. So for me, maybe let's define that as there will be no negative change to the objective markers that we use to track health, like hormonal function. We know that there's deleterious costs when you start dipping too low or trending too high. Maybe blood work markers like lipids, maybe renal health, maybe quality of life, maybe sleep, maybe perceived stress. The answer is no, with very specific...
I would also say time frame is probably quite important when you discuss that.
That might be edging on healthier though, because where do they end up?
Yeah.
So I would say, and you can give me your opinion on this, 99% of times, no, you cannot compete healthily, and there will be a direct negative health cost of competing across all bodybuilding federations, NPC, IFBB, PCA, even
the natural feds,
even things like NFM. Well, I was going to come on to that. Even things like NFM UK, if you got your more, or like Miami Pro, Purely, even these fitness model things. That wasn't meant to be degrading.
That wasn't a dig.
No, I coach people in these federations. My wife's competed with these federations. That there is some negative health cost to pay, but it's obviously gradient in nature. The leaner that you have to get, the bigger that you have to be. And then, as Matt rightly said, even in natural federations, there's no way that you're getting in condition, either male or female, bikini, bodybuilding, men's physique, whatever. You're not getting there without some negative impact on your endogenous hormonal function. The one caveat I would make would be in fitness fashion federations like WBFF that we mentioned, where the given individual is close enough to the criteria of the class that they don't have to shift drastically to get there. For example, Jazz competed in bikini in her normal off-season body composition. She didn't diet for the show. We changed nothing. She's off-season. Her blood work's fine. Her hormones are all in check. Her menstrual function is normal. Her sleep is normal. Her hunger's not... Everything is healthy, and she competed at that body composition. But that's very rare. And even in that federation, you get to diva, forget about it, you know?
Yeah, I think my only addendum to what Joe said there, and I completely agree with what he said, is it depends how close you look into competition. And I completely agree. If you're talking about the acute period of time around the competition, no, you can't do that healthily. It's not a healthy sport. Despite what some people like to think, oh, we're getting leaner, doing all these things, we know it's not healthy. We've got case studies, numerous reports to show this. It depends on how far we then look away from competition. If you then brought yourself back to normal body weight, good relationship with food, brought your health markers back into check, reduce your drug load, how much impact is that period of time competing affecting the rest of your life? Potentially not at all, potentially a lot. It really depends. And again, it kind of, at that point, becomes healthier, a nuanced discussion about lifetime use, whatever it may be. But certainly from the acute time point, no. The longer time point, that kind of goes into that risk education side of things we're talking about at the moment, where if we know the risks, we can potentially minimise them quite a lot. And if it's the only competition you ever do, yeah, maybe you can have the rest of your life absolutely fine. If you're going to be a seasoned competitor for 20 years, that risk all of a sudden goes up quite significantly.
So someone's asked me, why on my training split do I do delts at the beginning of my lower body days? So this could be...
I've got an idea why, but tell him, Joe. I'm going to guess it.
Is it because I've got tiny delts?
I can see you've got massive delts, actually. That's what I'm going to go for.
So this is a question really about specification of the individual. So delts have been a focused body part for me, and they really are for however many bodybuilders.
I've known you for a long time, and I've always known you going, I want massive delts.
Yeah, well, and they've always been a lagging body part. So if we consider where else I would put them, what, at the end of a push workout? Or at the beginning of a push workout, but then my chest work would suffer, and chest also is not a strong body part. At the end of a pull workout, I want the opportunity to train them fresh. My lower body's always been a stronger body part of mine, so putting them at the beginning of leg day, and also my tolerable volumes for the lower body are super low. You know, my minimum effective volume for hams is 2 sets, and I might get that up to 3 per session at the end of a meso before I overreach. Quads is the same, 2 to 3 sets. It's not a lot of time cost. Whereas delts, for me, you know, I can be up at 5 rep matching sets per session 4 days per week before I'm hitting MRV on them. So I need to be able to spread them over the week to get a good amount of effective volume, and I also need the opportunity to train them first. Now, in my experimentation of this also, I've found that my lower body work doesn't suffer. The neural fatigue of training the delts prior to training the legs is not sufficient to cause a reduction in the ability for me to load training the lower body. So it really is that simple. It offers me an opportunity to train the delts fresh. It doesn't cut into some massive length of training session that I would be if I put it on a push workout or on a pull workout, and it doesn't negatively impact my lower body training. So it makes sense to put it there, especially when you're training with a high frequency. I'm generally between 4 to 6 times per week on delts, you know.
Do you find moving on to a lower body days means, do you incorporate any overhead pressing?
No.
Okay, that was my next question. Do you incorporate any of that?
All of my delt work and pretty much all of my clients' delt work is lateral delts. That's it. Even rear delts I so rarely incorporate because I find with sufficient back volume, the rear delts are growing sufficiently. I can't remember the last time I programmed anterior delt work for anybody. It's just a hell of a lot. Most people's minimum effective volume, even up to maximum adaptive or maximum recoverable volume for the lateral delts, is so damn high. You've got to have a high frequency, man. Like most of my clients are training delts 4 times a week.
I would say 4 times a week on average. So I personally only recently started putting shoulder presses back in purely from an enjoyment standpoint, and they're sandwiching them in workouts where you maybe do a press on one session, a lateral on your subsequent lower body session. You can balance that fatigue easier as well. In addition to adding in the frequency, it's not the same. You're not having 2 pressing movements, for example, which would be quite fatiguing.
Right, let's talk about reps in reserve because
big topic.
Me and Dean McKillop were discussing a podcast this week that we both listened to. I won't name the podcast, but basically a lot of criticism of reps in reserve, some of it fair, some of it I would say unjust, maybe misunderstood. So realistically, clearing the air on a couple of things. Firstly, because somebody had asked me, how do you actually know if you're training hard enough training with reps in reserve? I've spoken about this before, you can use movement velocity. And also the challenge towards reps in reserve training which has been presented, which is that people don't know how to train to failure, therefore they can't accurately manage their reps in reserve.
And that to me feels like a bit of a straw man argument.
It is a straw man, but I can
also see it.
Yeah. So first thing is that people's reps in reserve targeting subjectively has been studied in trained individuals and it is pretty damn accurate. But I'll keep that out of the way because I know a lot of these people making these arguments won't want to know about that research data, which is fine. I think it's under the false pretense that people that train with reps in reserve never train to failure, which is absolutely untrue. At least a quarter of my training is spent training to a true 0 reps in reserve. I don't train beyond reps in reserve, I don't do force reps. You know, I would train to volitional failure for at least a quarter of every single training block. And then I've got that data there. Well, this is my performance at 0 reps in reserve. Next time I get to 0 reps in reserve, I want to be doing more than this. So that's one way to know how to know if you're training hard enough, and the necessity of, because I do believe you should be training to 0 reps in reserve, at least for 1 week of each mesocycle. And in terms of how to know if you're training hard enough with reps in reserve, I think velocity of movement is a good gauge, at least to begin with, to potentially stick with.
And we've got fairly decent data on that.
Yeah, we do. So around 3 or 4 reps in reserve is going to be about 50% velocity loss on the concentric portion of your rep, assuming that you're pretty explosive with the concentric part of your rep. If that's slowing down, you're training hard enough. If you progress from there, if you're adding load and reps per week, you're going to eventually get to 0 RIR. You're not going to linearly progressively overload until you're the strongest man on the planet. It's not going to happen. And you're going to know when you're at 0 reps in reserve because the rep ain't going to move. You know, so that essentially answers that question.
I can honestly see why people do get caught up about it. There's a quote I heard, I think it made me laugh because of how simply accurate it was. So the only true reps in reserve is 0, right? And I was like, that's a really good way of putting it, right? And I can understand the simplicity of it because if you, say you've got 2 levers, right? You've got 2 levers. One of them is your intensity and one of them is your volume. It's much easier rather than trying to muddle with 2 of them to put one of them all the way up to 10, to put that intensity to 0 reps in reserve to failure. And therefore you've only got to move one lever a little bit. I can understand the simplicity of that. But I think creating a false argument where you're saying everything has to be to failure is also a bit disingenuous. We know as long as you're training close enough, which is obviously a caveated, and as going back to that previous statement, it's probably a little bit less accurate than training to failure, obviously, because there is a subjective element to it. But we know training close enough is good enough. Then we can modulate that volume a little bit more. And I always like to give a personal example. I prefer training closer to failure, right? But that also doesn't mean that that is applicable for my entire training block or my entire body. I've got chocolate knees. Me trying to go to failure every time I trained quads, for example, I'm not going to be able to do that. I simply wouldn't be able to have the structural integrity in my knee, and I'd probably die, right? Not literally dying, but I'm probably going to hurt myself. Whereas upper body, I may be able to handle that. So I can have a different reps and reserve target across the body, sure. But I can also change that volume depending on my volume tolerance. Again, it's different levers, and I think having a broad brush statement and just saying, this is the only way you should train is always a dangerous philosophy to take.
Absolutely. So I've got an opinion piece on here that there's going to be no data on this, right? So I'm going to base this
Go ahead.
Purely on experience. Somebody's asked me about female anabolic androgenic steroid dose ranges across different classes. So all I can do is speak from experience, and I've got a lot of experience. I don't know if I certainly haven't got as much experience as a lot of people in this industry, but I know a lot of female competitors, you know, especially through my wife, and I coach a lot of them, and I've been to a lot of pro shows this year and spoke to a lot of females about what they're doing, etc., etc., not just this year. I also know multiple coaches with multiple pro level female competitors. So I have to kind of encapsulate this in an average, which is very hard to do because it is so disparate. You do have freaks that do nothing, and you've got some people that do absolutely astronomical stuff. So maybe I'll try and just give like an average dose structure for females. So most bikini competitors on the high level are somewhere between 0 and 70 milligrams a week of total anabolics, right? There are genuinely IFBB pro bikini girls that have never used anabolics. There genuinely are. I know some of them.
I think there's such a huge genetic component to that division as well, where you're going to have freaks.
Absolutely, and there's girls that do 70 milligram a week of Anavar or Primobolan. There's girls that do more, but these are averages, right? Now you're stepping up to figure, you'll see the 75 milligram to 150 milligram per week-ish. Now this is where it can get astronomical, because I have known pro figure competitors doing male dose cycles with male dose testosterone and things like that. Most of the really good ones don't, and you can tell by the virilization status. Look at Sydney, current Miss Figure Olympia. Feminine as they come. Feminine voice, feminine features. She could be on 0 milligram. You know, I would bet my savings that she's never done more than 150 milligram, unless she is just freakishly resistant to virilization. And when you get into women's physique, sky's the limit. Sky really is the limit in women's physique in my experience. But in recent times, we've seen a sort of trend away from the closer to female bodybuilding kind of look. It's become more disparate from that, and you've got some really I met Natalie Coelho, I don't know if you can, how do you pronounce that, at the New York Pro this year, and I spoke to her backstage. Complete feminine voice, real feminine features. Sorry if you can hear that, guys. Someone's like drilling. Probably don't
I know we're filming.
But anyway, in my experience of physique competitors, yeah, we're somewhere in the 200 to 300, maybe 400 milligram per week dose range. And all of these with the context of a lot of these women these days are running like a baseline dose of testosterone. In bikini, you would just see DHT derivatives mostly, Anavar, Primobolan, sometimes Matt Strong. In figure, I have seen more nandrolone used. They'll sometimes use low doses of trenbolone towards a show. In physique, it gets much more interesting, so to speak. I do see the Superdrol, the Winstrol, Mastron's more common, Trembolone's more common. But you don't really see on average girls using more higher doses of testosterone. You get the odd case. Historically, there's certainly plenty of cases of that. But that's the kind of generality.
One thing I was going to ask you, Joe, is from my experience, you might differ. Do you feel there's a different mentality, for example, going from bikini to wellness to figure in terms of...
Oh, I miss wellness.
So we can cover that.
How did I do that?
In terms of the dosaging, because what I tend to see, and again you might disagree, is the general consensus in bikini is the reason we're talking about that maybe 70 milligram per week is because I can take 10 milligram of Anavar.
Yeah, 100%.
I can take it within a tablet form, and as we go up the divisions, that's where injectables become more acceptable within that sphere of the of the class. Is that something that you tend to see?
100%. Yeah, bikini is just so simple. It'd be 5 or 10 milligram out of hour a day. Done. Or half a mil of Primo per week.
Yeah.
50 milligram, maybe up to 75 milligram if you've got 150 milligram per mil. It normally is that simple because it is so straightforward. But then when you get into the realms of more injectable drugs, yeah, you kind of dose ranges become. And let me talk about my experience with wellness. And I've got a pro wellness client I was over at the New York Pro with, and I spoke with a lot of the girls back there. Genuinely the same as bikini. These people are just freaks. And you have to be a freak to compete in that division. The criteria is such, you can't just grow muscle tissue on a structurally incorrect, to say, frame.
When I said about genetics in bikini, I think that I don't think there's a class in bodybuilding, male and female, that is genetically predisposed as wellness, in my opinion.
Yeah, my pro wellness girl, we've never done more than 70 milligram for 4 weeks.
Which is crazy.
And she's huge.
Yeah.
She's absolutely jacked out of her mind. And that's 4 weeks out of the whole year.
I would probably sell my right testicle for her quads.
Well, yeah, it's like the first time I've seen her glutes in person this year. I was looking, I was like,
is this real life?
Like, Chaz, that doesn't even make sense.
Is this real life?
Defies gravity.
But I do think there's such a huge genetic component. It's a topic for another day, but do you feel in wellness sight enhancement is taking over drug use?
I was just about to say that because I'm very closely linked with Mediform, the class that has the greatest degree of sight enhancement is bikini. And in wellness, it appears to be very rare. Again, it seems like these people are just freaky enough.
Because I know there's a lot of conversation around certainly the South Americans in terms of, I don't want to say Mediform use, but sight enhancement.
No, they often use, is cycline and those, and they like the local MGF injections and things like that. Yeah, so I haven't got direct experience with those people really, but I can tell you who we sell Mediform to, and it's mostly bikini athletes and a lot of pro bikini athletes. Figure, yeah, and they're using it in like delts and arms and lots of stuff, but bikini, you're talking mils upon mils in the glutes.
I'll just, a little anecdotal story. I won't name the show, I won't name anyone. I've gone backstage, just helping a friend out, and I've seen a female bikini athlete with it's a needle in the glute, but I'm not talking in the side of the glute, ventral glute, I'm talking straight in the back of the butt. Back of the butt. Just popping loads of Mediform in there. I mean, each their own, but...
Probably wouldn't do it backstage.
No, but there you go.
Bleed on your tan. There's a hot tip.
Yeah, don't bleed on your tan.
Jay behind the cam knows this one. Always do your medi right before your tan. Or if you're not, if you can't do that, cotton buds. As soon as you pull out the pin, cotton bud on the side.
It's not a good look when you're getting blood in your tan.
No, I mean, you can fix it.
Pro tip.
Can fix it, but cotton bud, that's the one.